How many of us think criminal when we see a prisoner and are even so quick to wish they rot in jail? Well, I do. At least I did before I knew what I know now. I used to before I learned that not all prisoners are guilty as charged. And while the law states that a person is innocent until proven guilty, for some countries like Uganda, a person is guilty until proven innocent. But how far can one go to prove oneself innocent while being incarcerated in the country's biggest maximum prison? Today we bring you the story of a young wife who lost everything, her husband, her child, dreams of the future, and her freedom in just one night. Welcome back to Tavern Crime Chronicles. Here we explore mysterious, chilling, solved and unsolved cases, approaching them with empathy and extensive research. If you have the nerve for fascinating stories, this is your channel. So, grab a drink and hydrate while I take you through the disconcerting story of a woman torn beyond repair. When a young man is murdered while he lies in bed with his wife, fingers are so quick to point at the wife as the murderer, and in most cases is always the chief suspect. In Africa and beyond, the spouse is always the number one suspect in the event of a murder or even questionable illness. But what happens when a young wife is accused of her husband's murder and immediately slapped with a death sentence? This is the story of Susan Kigula. Born to parents Canon Godfrey Njagala and mother Gertrude Kigula Njagala, Susan was born and raised in a large family in the central Ugandan cattle farming town of Masaka, about miles southwest of Kampala City. She grew up just like any other child in a loving African home and was very much loved by her father, a daddy's girl, as most would call her. She was a little girl with many dreams, as her parents encouraged her to dream on because they do come true, and for this. She often told her father that she wanted to work in the bank because she thought it was a good job and would make her feel strong and independent. Susan enjoyed a sheltered middle-class upbringing together with her 3 brothers and 5 sisters centered around a close-knit church community. Unfortunately, her happy childhood didn't prepare her for what was to come in adulthood. Unable to complete her ordinary level education due to financial difficulties, Susan sought to better her life, and she got a job in a small gift shop in Kampala. She had been working for a couple of years when she met Constantine Saremba, who was 28 years old by then. He was 10 years her senior, but in him she found love and would later move in with him in a come-we-stay marriage relationship. They had humble beginnings as the apartment rental house in which they lived was small with just 2 rooms, but to Susan, it was ideal for their small family, which included Constantine's young son from a previous relationship. Before long, they too were blessed with a daughter of their own. The 2 lovebirds enjoyed a blissful marriage and were often seen together as they would go to the cinema, the park, and other hangouts. In fact, their peers often teased them by calling them twins because they were so in sync. They were not rich but were happy as they had each other, saw the best in every situation, and never dwelled on the negative. This outlook on life would unknowingly save her life many years later. She just didn't know how yet. July 9th, 2000. This ill-fated day could have been another forgettable evening, but alas. The young family ate dinner together, laughed and reminisced about the day's occurrences as they usually did. They later retired to bed, to the single bedroom they shared with both their children, while the housemaid, Patience Nansamba, was on a mattress in the living room area next door. At around a.m., in the eerie hours of the dark night, Susan was awakened by a piercing, flashing blow to the back of her neck. In confusion, she felt her neck lazily, and there was hot blood oozing from a wound on her neck. The sheets were wet with blood, but it was not just hers. Her heart was now racing with fear of what had happened. She couldn't immediately take in the scene because the lights were off, but as she felt for her husband on his side of the bed and couldn't find him, she immediately sat up dizzily in bed, totally confused. With the small light trickling in from the security lights outside, she noticed that the children were awake, distressed but unharmed, fortunately. Constantine was on the floor, groaning in pain, and she noticed his neck was cut. It was all happening so quickly she could hardly comprehend. The housemaid, Patience, quickly ran into the bedroom, saying she had seen 2 men ran out of the room a few moments earlier. Desperate to get help from the neighbors, Susan unsteadily made her way outside, her vision so blurred she could hardly see, and she was almost crawling as she was so unsteady on her feet due to the dizziness. She made her way to a nearby restaurant where she was given a blanket, and that's when she realized that she had run out of the house naked, She had barely explained her ordeal when her body gave way, and she passed out. Susan woke up hours later in hospital, the wound at the back on her neck still throbbing, and learned that her partner, Constantine, had died. With the knowledge that their children were safe in the care of her relatives, she lay back in the hospital bed, tears flooding her pained eyes, and that's when it dawned on her that she had lived a happy life up until now. A contented childhood, a successful relationship, a good job, all gone in a blink of an eye. Constantine's burial was slated for the next day, which he attended like a zombie and was brought back to hospital. She couldn't comprehend what had happened, and why, because to the best of her knowledge, nothing had been stolen. When she heard their death announcements on the radio, she knew that whoever it was wanted both dead, but for what reason? That she would never know. But the worst was yet to come. The events that followed would alter the trajectory of her life forever. 3 days after the burial of her one true love, Susan received a visit from the police, who, to her amazement, charged her with murder and whisked her straight to Luzira, the maximum security prison on the outskirts of Kampala, to await her trial. Unfortunately for her, her 3-year-old stepson told Constantine's family that he had seen Susan and Patience, the housemaid, kill his father. Of course, Susan knew that he was still confused and traumatized by the horrific event, and thus she held on to her confidence in the justice system to see through that, but that was not the case. Also, it was possible that one of her in-laws told her stepson to say that, and you know how a kid's mind is. He probably believed it and recanted it when asked by the court officials. Susan, being naive, then thought that the jury could see the truth of her innocence. She had not hired a lawyer, and in any case she couldn't afford one, so she trusted the justice system. Obviously, she was wrong. 2 years later, Susan Kigula and Patience Nansamba were found guilty of the murder of Constantine Saremba, based on the testimonies of her stepson, and the police who found the blood-stained panga and a machete-like farming tool in the doorway of the bedroom of the flat belonging to Susan. They were both convicted for murdering Constantine and served with a death sentence that came mandatory with the murder conviction, and the method would be hanging. At the very young age of 21, Susan's life, as she knew it, had come to a stop. Luzira Maximum Prison became her new home, waking up each day wondering if that would be the day that she would be hanged. The conditions there were dire, as prisoners often slept on one shoulder, packed together so that they could only shift if an entire row agreed to roll at once. Inmates were sometimes confined in isolation cells, often naked, handcuffed, and sometimes denied food. The cells occasionally flooded with water up to ankle height. After accepting her fate, she made friends with the other 50 or so prisoners in her death row section, whom she discovered were like her, wrongfully accused. And some were involved in crimes of passion, definitely did not deserve to be hanged. Susan became a leader among the prisoners and asked them to change their attitudes. She forgave her accusers and asked the women to do the same. Like the leader she was, Susan mobilized a choir, wrote songs, started playing netball, and led the prison dance troupe to keep her spirits up, and spent a lot of time thinking positively. She learned that the men's neighboring wing had access to education, while the women's did not, and so she asked the wardens if she could incorporate it. With no teachers to service them, Susan became their teacher. And like they say, if you want to understand anything better, teach it to someone else. And this she did under the tree that worked as a classroom. One of her biggest cheerleaders was Alexander McLean, the young British founder of African Prisons Project, who saw that she was dynamic, motivated, and had great humility, never tiring of serving others. To take you a little back, it was in 2003, and Alexander McLean, the 18-year-old British student Alexander McLean, was taking a break from his studies after obtaining a law degree. After finishing school, a few years earlier, McLean had volunteered at Mulago Hospital in Kampala, hoping to bolster his CV for university, and had been deeply disturbed by the dire conditions there. He saw patients lying on upswept floors, often in pools of vomit and blood. Their families were required to provide fresh sheets and towels, but when the patients were prisoners, relatives often left them to fend for themselves. McLean found himself drawn to these patients, some of whom were handcuffed to their beds. Curious about the conditions they faced in custody, he visited Luzira Upper Prison. He was struck by how massively overcrowded it was, how young the inmates were, how few had decent legal representation. A particularly gruesome and avoidable death of a young male prisoner in the jail prompted McLean, on his return to London, to raise money for healthcare facilities for prisoners in Uganda. He set up the African Prisons Project. When he returned to Uganda in 2005 to oversee the refurbishing of the sick bay at Luzira Women's Prison, Susan Kigula, the now under the tree teacher, began to act as his translator. She made an instant impression on him. By this time, Kigula had been in prison for 5 years. McLean had been working with Ugandan authorities to improve conditions beyond the sick bay too. His organization sponsored sports activities, ran mother and baby reading groups and adult literacy classes. Kigula acted as an intermediary between the charity and the prison authorities on a project to open a prison library. In 2011, Kigula and a group of other prisoners supported by African Prisons Project became the first Ugandan prisoners to take a correspondence course with the University of London, studying law. The project was a huge success. As time went on, prison staff would come to her for legal advice. Then Kigula started a legal clinic in prison to help fellow inmates with bail applications, writing memorandums of appeal for them and teaching them how to represent themselves in court if they couldn't afford a lawyer. She helped dozens of inmates get released from prison. Emboldened by her academic success, Kigula decided, even before she completed her University of London degree, to organize a petition challenging Uganda's mandatory death sentence. The process would take years. Susan Kigula and 417 others versus Attorney General is a landmark case. The petitioners, all on death row, aim to abolish capital punishment by declaring it unconstitutional. When the Supreme Court of Uganda gave its ruling on January 21, 2009, it did not abolish the death penalty. However, it did rule that a sentence of death should not be mandatory in cases of murder, and that a condemned person should not be kept on death row indefinitely. If a convict is not executed within 3 years, the sentence is automatically turned into life imprisonment. And in light of these changes, the Supreme Court ruled that death row inmates could go back to the High Court for retrial. Kigula would have another day in court. While in court trying to prove herself innocent, in November 2011, she mentioned that in the previous hearing she had called out to her stepson using the word sorry. It was not a confession. As the press chose to interpret it, it was an expression of regret for what he had been through. She still proclaimed her innocence, pleading not guilty to murder for a second time, but the court and the media were not convinced. The High Court reduced Kigula's sentence to 20 years, and with 4 taken off for her time in remand, and she was released from prison in 2016. It felt like she was coming to an alien new world walking on the moon. Everything seemed fresh, but unfortunately her father had died while she was in prison, and her mother had been killed in a road accident just 2 months before her release. Reuniting with her now 19-year-old daughter was everything for her, for she calls Susan her hero, and she could dream again. From a prisoner sentenced to death to now a hope for the many hopeless inmates, Susan has new goals. She wants the authorities to reduce the sentence of the remaining 417 inmates from her petition. Although dozens were released like her, some are still behind bars. Working with Alexander McLean and African Prisons Project, Kigula plans to establish the world's first prison-based legal college and law firm, where prisoner lawyers would represent peers who cannot afford legal help. Obviously, there are guilty people in prison, but everyone deserves due process, and we hope that next time you look at a prisoner, you will not rush to judge but give them 1 second glance. They are human. Well, thank you for watching. What do you think of this sad story with a light at the end of the dark tunnel? Susan lost everything, the love of her life, her children, and her freedom all at once. Would you have been strong and hopeful like her? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. We put in so much work in the research, compilation, and editing of these stories. Kindly support us by subscribing, like, and share to keep us encouraged, help us grow the channel. Thank you. And I will see you at the next one.